Hi everyone. So the lab that I chose to do, I called the balloon lab. And overall what this was I took 6 empty bottles and I filled them all up with the exact same amount of water, which was 50 milliliters. And then I used yeast and sugar to create a reaction which put carbon dioxide into the air. And while the carbon dioxide was being put into the air, the bottles were covered with balloons to then show what reaction with what amount of yeast and what amount of sugar created the most carbon dioxide. This image shows what the beginning of the experiment looked like, which included these 6 bottles, and on the far right is the one that had more yeast, and on the far left, they are the bottles with more sugar. And in the middle, the one that has the balloon already on it is the controlled bottle, which only includes water. To do this, I started with 6 bottles, as I said. On the far left, I had 16 grams of sugar and only 4 grams of yeast. Coming in, I did 8 grams of sugar, 4 grams of yeast, and then to make it even, I did 4 grams of yeast and 4 grams of sugar. Of course, to keep a controlled bottle, it was just 50 milliliters of warm water. And then going over to the right, it was 8 grams of yeast and 4 grams of sugar, and then also 16 grams of yeast and 4 grams of sugar. The findings after doing this experiment, which was having the yeast poured into the water and sugar that was already in the bottle, and then putting the balloon over the bottle. And the 2 that had actually the biggest carbon dioxide release was the one with 16 grams of yeast and 4 grams of sugar, but then also on the way other side, it was the one that had 16 grams of sugar and 4 grams of yeast. This image is what the end of the experiment looked like. As you can see, the balloons that are pushed up on their own are actually the ones that are filled with carbon dioxide. The one on the far right is the one with the most yeast, which also created the largest amount of carbon dioxide, and then the one on the left is the second largest balloon, which also had the most amount of sugar. And this goes to show that the balloons were essentially all even, which could have been due to a few little errors, and it also shows just what the lab should have looked like and how the balloons did have a reaction filling up with carbon dioxide due to the yeast, sugar, and water reacting with each other. What I learned from this is that even if there is a little bit of something, if it has a lot of energy that it could feel off of, then it will still output a lot of energy. And that's seen with the one that had only 4 grams of yeast and 16 grams of sugar, because the 4 grams of yeast was able to keep feeding off of all of the sugar, which then created more energy output, which was carbon dioxide. And on the way other side of things, it still shows that the yeast still can use a little bit of sugar for energy because there's more yeast, and it obviously created a bigger carbon dioxide reaction. Knowing that yeast eats sugar to create the carbon dioxide reaction, this led to me thinking, why would both the one with the most amount of yeast and the least amount of yeast make the biggest reaction? And the findings for this is that obviously the one with the most amount of yeast had the most amount of yeast that was eating the sugar to create the carbon dioxide. But on the other side of things, the one with the little amount of yeast actually had so much sugar and energy to fuel itself that the yeast just kept eating more and more sugar to also create a very large output of carbon dioxide. This proves my hypothesis of if I increase the amount of sugar or yeast, then the amount of gas released into the balloon chamber would increase because either sugar or yeast are causing the increased gas release. And although I couldn't pinpoint it down to if it is the sugar or the yeast that is causing the biggest gas release, it does go to show that both the sugar and the yeast are needed to create a large carbon dioxide gas release.